The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in Philadelphia, and Margaret Jane Winters knew her comfortable life was about to end before she even opened the yellow envelope. Her father had died 3 weeks prior, leaving her alone in the world at 22 years old with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. The telegram was from a lawyer in Dalhart, Texas, informing her that her late mother's sister, whom Margaret had never met, had left her a small property. It was not much, the telegram said, but it was hers if she wanted it. The alternative was the workhouse or a hasty marriage to the butcher's son, who had been eyeing her with increasingly bold interest at her father's funeral. Margaret packed her 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, and what little money remained after settling the funeral expenses. She had never been west of the Schuylkill River, but desperation made adventurers of even the most timid souls. It was May of 1883, and the journey by rail would take nearly a week. The train ride was nothing like the romantic descriptions she had read in dime novels. The seats were hard, the air thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, and by the time she reached Texas, her emerald traveling dress was covered in soot, and her auburn hair had escaped its pins entirely. When she finally stepped off the train in Dalhart, the late afternoon sun hit her like a physical blow. Philadelphia had been warm, but this was something else entirely, a dry heat that seemed to pull the moisture from her skin. The town was smaller than she had imagined, just a main street with wooden buildings that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. Dust covered everything, and the few people on the street stopped to stare at her as though she were a circus attraction. Margaret smoothed her skirts and lifted her chin, trying to maintain some dignity despite knowing she must look a fright. "Miss Winters." A thin man in a dark suit approached, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "I'm Theodore Mills, the lawyer who sent the telegram. Welcome to Dalhart." "Thank you, Mr. Mills." Margaret's voice came out raspier than intended. The dust had worked its way into her throat. "Let me take you to your property. It's about 2 miles outside of town." He gestured to a wagon that had seen better days. "I must warn you, Miss Winters, it's not much. Your aunt was, well, she was an unusual woman. Came out here 30 years ago with her husband. He died of fever 5 years back, and she lived alone until she passed this winter." The ride to the property did nothing to lift Margaret's spirits. The land was flat and brown, stretching endlessly in all directions under a sky so vast it made her dizzy to look at it. She was used to buildings and cobblestones, street lamps, and the sound of carriages. Here there was nothing but space and silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels. The house, when they reached it, was a small wooden structure that leaned slightly to one side. The barn was in better shape, surprisingly, and there was a well and a small corral. A few scraggly chickens scattered as the wagon approached. "Your aunt raised horses," Mr. Mills explained. "She had quite a reputation for it, actually. There are still 3 horses in the barn. They're yours, along with the property and what little money she had saved. About $200, which should keep you going for a few months if you're careful." Margaret climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady after the journey. $200 sounded like a fortune to someone who had nothing, but she had no idea how to raise horses or run a property or even how to survive in this harsh, empty place. "There's a ranch about a mile north of here," Mr. Mills continued, seemingly oblivious to her growing panic. "The Walker place. They're good people. Quinn Walker runs it with his father. They might be willing to help if you need anything. Quinn Walker." Margaret filed the name away, though she had no intention of asking anyone for help. She had made it this far on her own, and she would figure out the rest. After Mr. Mills left, Margaret explored her new home. The house was sparsely furnished but clean, and to her surprise, there were books on a shelf. Her aunt had been a reader. That one detail made Margaret feel slightly less alone. She found some tinned food in the pantry and a jar of preserves that looked recent. Someone, probably a neighbor, had stocked the basics. As the sun set, painting the endless sky in shades of orange and pink that took her breath away, Margaret sat on the rickety porch and allowed herself a moment of tears. She had never felt so alone or so out of place. But she had also never been free before, she realized. In Philadelphia, her life had been prescribed from birth the appropriate clothes, the appropriate behavior, the appropriate future as someone's wife and mother. Here, she could be anything, if she survived. The next morning, Margaret woke to roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through thin curtains. Her body ached from sleeping on the unfamiliar mattress, and when she looked in the small mirror above the wash basin, she barely recognized herself. Her face was sunburned from just the brief exposure the day before, and her hair was a wild tangle. She dressed in her simplest dress, a gray cotton that was already too warm for the climate, and ventured outside. The chickens needed feeding, she assumed, though she had no idea what to feed them. In the barn, she found 3 horses, a brown mare, a black gelding, and a young chestnut with white socks. They all turned to look at her with what she could only describe as skepticism. "Hello," she said softly, approaching the mare. "I'm Margaret. I suppose I own you now, though I have no idea what to do with you." The mare snorted and turned away, apparently unimpressed. Margaret found what looked like oats in a bin and carefully distributed them into the feed buckets in each stall. The horses ate, at least, so she must have done something right. She located eggs in the chicken coop, nearly screaming when a hen pecked at her hand, and managed to make herself a meager breakfast. By mid-morning, she was already exhausted and overwhelmed. She needed supplies from town, but she had no idea how to hitch up a wagon or ride a horse. In Philadelphia, she had always taken a carriage or walked. The 2 miles to Dalhart might as well have been 200. She was standing in the yard, staring at the barn and trying to muster her courage when she heard hoofbeats. A rider was approaching from the north, sitting easy in the saddle as though he had been born there. As he drew closer, Margaret could make out a tall man in worn denim and a dusty hat, with a red bandana around his neck. He reined in his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning. You must be Miss Winters. I'm Quinn Walker from the ranch up north." Margaret's first thought was that Quinn Walker was nothing like the men she had known in Philadelphia. He was probably close to her age, maybe a year or 2 older, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. He sat his horse with unconscious grace, and when he dismounted, she saw he was tall and lean with broad shoulders and capable hands. "How do you do, Mr. Walker?" Margaret tried to sound confident and probably failed. "Thank you for coming by. Figured you might need some help getting settled." "Your aunt was a good neighbor." He glanced around the property with an assessing eye. "Horses doing all right, I think so. I fed them." Something in her voice must have given her away because his expression softened slightly. "You don't know much about horses." "I don't know anything about horses, or chickens, or this place." The admission burst out before she could stop it. "I'm from Philadelphia. I'd never even seen a horse up close until yesterday." To her surprise, Quinn did not laugh. He just nodded slowly. "Well, that's all right. Everyone has to start somewhere. You planning to stay, or are you going to sell the place?" "I have nowhere else to go," Margaret said honestly. "So I suppose I am staying, whether I know how or not." Quinn studied her for a long moment, and Margaret fought the urge to fidget under his gaze. She probably looked ridiculous to him, a city girl in a wrinkled dress, already red-faced from the sun and clearly helpless. "Tell you what," he said finally. I've got some time this morning. Why don't I show you a few things? How to check on the horses properly, where the property lines are, that sort of thing. Pride warred with desperation, and desperation won. That would be very kind of you, Mr. Walker. Quinn, he corrected. Out here we don't stand much on ceremony. He showed her how to properly check each horse, running his hands expertly over their legs and looking at their hooves. He explained what to watch for, signs of injury or illness, and Margaret tried to memorize everything even as she felt increasingly hopeless. There was so much to know, so many ways she could fail. This is Daisy, Quinn said, patting the brown mare. She was your aunt's favorite, good-tempered and steady. This here is Scout, and the young one is called Copper. Do they need to be ridden? Margaret asked. Horses do better with regular exercise, Quinn confirmed. You know how to ride? Margaret shook her head. You're going to need to learn, he said matter-of-factly. Can't get around out here without a horse. The wagon's useful, but you need to be able to ride. The thought of climbing onto one of those large animals and somehow making it go where she wanted seemed impossible. But Quinn was right. She could see that already. Without the ability to ride, she was trapped here, dependent on others for everything. Could you teach me? The words came out before she could second-guess them. Quinn looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. You want to learn? I don't have much choice, do I? I mean, yes, I want to learn. I need to learn. He considered this, then nodded. All right. I can come by a few times a week, show you the basics. Fair warning, though, you're going to fall. Everyone does. I'm used to being laughed at, Margaret said quietly. I won't laugh at you for trying, Quinn said, and there was something in his voice that made her believe him. They spent the rest of the morning walking the property boundaries. Quinn pointed out landmarks, explained where the good grazing was, and showed her how to check the water level in the well. He was patient and thorough, never making her feel stupid for her endless questions. By the time he left, promising to return the following morning for her first riding lesson, Margaret felt slightly less terrified of her new life. That afternoon, she walked to town, determined to start building her independence. The 2-mile walk left her sweaty and dusty, and when she entered the general store, the proprietor looked her up and down with obvious curiosity. You're the city girl, he said. Not a question. I'm Margaret Winters, she corrected firmly. I need to open an account for supplies. She purchased flour, sugar, coffee, and a few other essentials, along with a bonnet that would actually protect her face from the sun. The proprietor, whose name was Hank Sanders, was friendly enough once he realized she had money to spend. Still, she noticed other customers staring and whispering. By the time she made the long walk home, laden with parcels, she was exhausted and her feet had blisters. But she had done it. She had gone to town and back on her own, and she had not died or gotten lost or made a complete fool of herself. It was a small victory, but it was hers. Quinn arrived the next morning just after dawn, as promised. He was leading Daisy on a rope, already saddled. We'll start with the basics, he said. First, you need to know how to saddle and bridle a horse. Can't always count on someone else doing it for you. For the next hour, Margaret struggled with heavy leather and confusing buckles while Daisy stood with patient resignation. Her hands fumbled with unfamiliar straps, and she could feel sweat trickling down her back despite the early hour. Quinn demonstrated once, then watched as she tried to replicate his actions, offering quiet corrections when needed. It's too complicated, Margaret said in frustration after her third attempt to place the saddle resulted in it sliding sideways. It's new, Quinn corrected. That's different from complicated. You'll get it. His confidence in her was baffling, but also strangely comforting. He did not seem to expect her to fail, even though she expected it herself. Finally, she managed to get the saddle on properly and secured. Her arms ached, but she felt a surge of pride. "Good," Quinn said. "Now let's get you on her." Margaret looked at the horse, which suddenly seemed very tall, and then at Quinn. "How exactly does one get on?" He showed her how to place her foot in the stirrup and swing up, making it look effortless. Then it was her turn. It took 3 tries, and she nearly fell backwards twice, but eventually she was sitting in the saddle, gripping the pommel with white knuckles. "Relax," Quinn said, amusement finally creeping into his voice. "You're stiffer than a board. The horse can feel your tension. I'm terrified of falling off. Then you'll fall off, it happens, but you get back on." He took hold of Daisy's bridle. "I'm going to lead her around the corral. All you need to do is sit there and get used to the feeling." For the next half hour, Quinn led Daisy in slow circles while Margaret clung to the saddle and tried not to panic. The horse's movement was strange and unsettling, nothing like riding in a carriage. But gradually, very gradually, she began to relax slightly. Daisy was gentle and steady, just as Quinn had said. "You're doing fine," Quinn called up to her. "Keep your back straight, shoulders back. There you go." By the time he helped her down, Margaret's legs were shaking and she was certain she would never walk normally again. But she had been on a horse. She had taken the first step. "Same time tomorrow?" Quinn asked. "Yes. Thank you, Quinn," he nodded, touching his hat brim, and rode off. Margaret watched him go, noting the easy way he moved with his horse, as though they were one creature. She could not imagine ever being that comfortable, but perhaps she did not need to be. Perhaps she just needed to be competent enough to survive. The lessons continued over the following weeks. Quinn came every morning, patient and encouraging as Margaret slowly progressed from clinging desperately to the saddle to actually controlling Daisy's movements. She fell twice, just as he had predicted. The first time, she landed hard on her backside and sat in the dust, mortified and winded. Quinn simply held out a hand to help her up and said, "That one wasn't too bad. Let's go again." The second fall was worse. Daisy had been startled by a rattlesnake, and Margaret went flying. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs and scrape her palms raw. For a moment she lay there, fighting tears of frustration and pain. This was impossible. She would never learn. She should just give up and go back to Philadelphia and marry the butcher's son. Then Quinn was kneeling beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You all right? Anything broken?" "Just my pride," Margaret managed, though her voice was shaky. "Pride heals faster than bones." He helped her sit up, checking her over with practiced efficiency. "Scrapes and bruises, you'll be sore tomorrow." "I can't do this." "You just did." "You stayed on while Daisy spooked, and you've only been riding for 2 weeks. That takes skill." He met her eyes, his expression serious. "Margaret, you're doing better than you think. Most people would have quit by now." Something about the way he said her name, without any formality or pity, just straightforward honesty, made her believe him. She got back on the horse. As the weeks passed, Margaret's life began to settle into a rhythm. She woke with the sun, tended the chickens and horses, practiced her riding, and worked on maintaining the property. Quinn taught her not just to ride but to rope, to mend fences, to read the weather. His father, Samuel Walker, stopped by once with a gift of fresh beef and stayed to share coffee and advice about managing the land. "You're doing well," Samuel said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Your aunt would be proud. She was tough as nails, that woman." "Looks like you've got some of that in you too." Margaret did not feel tough. She felt constantly overwhelmed and uncertain, but she was still here, still trying, and that had to count for something. The townspeople's attitudes began to shift as well. At first, they had watched her with barely concealed amusement, waiting for the city girl to fail and flee back east. But as weeks turned into months and Margaret remained, working her property and learning her new life, she gradually earned a measure of respect. Hank Sanders started greeting her by name at the store. The postmaster tipped his hat when she came for her infrequent mail. Women began to nod to her on the street instead of whispering behind their hands. But respect in a frontier town was earned through action, not time, and Margaret knew she was still on trial. She proved herself in small ways, helping a neighbor recover a stray calf, sharing eggs with a family whose chickens had been killed by coyotes, sitting up all night with a colicky horse, and saving its life through sheer stubborn determination. It was Quinn, though, who remained her constant. He came by several times a week, always finding some excuse, checking on the horses, mending a fence, bringing news from town. Margaret began to anticipate his visits, catching herself listening for hoofbeats and feeling a flutter of pleasure when she saw him riding up. She told herself it was just gratitude. Quinn had been kind when others laughed, patient when she fumbled, encouraging when she wanted to quit. He had taught her not just to ride, but to believe she could survive this harsh new world. Of course, she would value his friendship. But friendship did not explain why her heart beat faster when he smiled at her, or why she found herself noticing the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, or how safe she felt when he was near. One August afternoon, nearly 3 months after her arrival in Dalhart, Quinn found her in the barn struggling to handle Copper, the young chestnut. The horse was spirited and stubborn, and Margaret had been trying for an hour to get a bridle on him. "Need some help?" Quinn's voice made her jump. She turned, frustrated and sweaty, hair falling out of its pins. "He won't let me near him. I've tried everything." Quinn approached Copper slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. The horse's ears pricked forward, and within minutes, Quinn had him bridled and calm. Margaret watched with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "How do you do that?" "Practice and patience." Copper's young yet still testing his boundaries. Quinn ran a hand along the horse's neck. "You've been trying to force him. You need to convince him instead." "I don't know how to do that." "You're learning. You're better with Daisy now than I am with some horses I've ridden for years." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "You've got instincts, Margaret. You just don't trust them yet." "In Philadelphia, my instincts told me to stay inside where it was safe and do what I was told. Those instincts aren't very useful here." "Maybe you needed new instincts. Maybe you needed to become someone new." He paused, then added quietly, "I like who you're becoming." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that Margaret was almost afraid to examine too closely. She had been so focused on survival, on learning and adapting and proving herself, that she had not allowed herself to think about other possibilities. About Quinn as anything more than her teacher and friend. But now, standing in the barn with dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight and Copper shifting quietly beside them, she could not avoid the truth anymore. She had feelings for Quinn Walker that went far beyond gratitude. "I should get back," Quinn said, breaking the moment. "We've got a herd coming in tomorrow, going to be busy for a few days." "Of course. Thank you for the help with Copper." He nodded and left, and Margaret stood alone in the barn, her heart racing. She should not be having these feelings. She barely knew him, despite the time they had spent together, and he had never indicated that he saw her as anything other than a neighbor who needed assistance. He was probably just being kind, doing what any decent person would do. But the way he had looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he said he liked who she was becoming, that had not felt like simple kindness. The next few days were lonely without Quinn's visits. Margaret kept busy, working with the horses and maintaining her property. She had become competent at most basic tasks, though she still struggled with Copper's stubborn independence. In the evenings, she sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the endless plains, and tried not to think about Quinn. On the fourth day, she decided she was being ridiculous. She was not some delicate flower waiting for a man's attention. She had survived the loss of her father, traveled halfway across the country alone, and built a new life in a harsh and unforgiving land. If she wanted to see Quinn, she could ride over to the Walker Ranch. She was capable of saddling a horse and riding a few miles now. He had taught her that. The next morning she dressed carefully in her least worn dress, saddled Daisy, and set off north. The ride was easier than she expected. Daisy knew the way and needed little guidance, and Margaret found herself enjoying the movement and the warm breeze. After months in Texas, she had adjusted to the heat and even started to appreciate the vast open sky that had initially made her dizzy. The Walker Ranch was larger than she had imagined, with a substantial house, several barns, and extensive corrals. Cattle dotted the landscape, and she could see several ranch hands working in the distance. She felt suddenly self-conscious about showing up unannounced, but before she could turn back, Samuel Walker emerged from the barn. "Miss Margaret, what brings you by? I hope I'm not intruding. I thought I might see Quinn if he's not too busy." Samuel's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. "He's out checking the fence line in the south pasture. Should be back soon. Why don't you come in and have some coffee? My wife would love to meet you properly." Martha Walker was a warm, practical woman who immediately made Margaret feel welcome. Over coffee and fresh biscuits in the large kitchen, she peppered Margaret with questions about her property and her plans, nodding approvingly at the answers. "You've done well," Martha said. "Not many city folks could make the adjustment. Quinn says you're a natural with horses now." "He talks about me." Martha's eyes twinkled. "More than he probably realizes. He's been in better spirits these last few months than I've seen him in years." Before Margaret could process that information, they heard hoofbeats outside. Quinn came through the door a moment later, dusty and tired, and stopped short when he saw Margaret sitting at the kitchen table. "Margaret, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. I just thought I would visit." "If that's all right." His face broke into a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Of course it's all right. I'm glad you came." He glanced down at himself. "Let me wash up and I'll give you a tour." Martha caught Margaret's eye and winked, and Margaret felt her cheeks flush. Quinn showed her around the ranch, explaining the operations with obvious pride. The Walker family had built this from nothing, he told her, arriving in Texas 30 years ago when it was even wilder and more dangerous than it was now. They had survived droughts and storms, rustlers and market crashes through hard work and determination. "Your father must be proud," Margaret said. "I suppose he is. Though sometimes I think he wishes I would settle down, start a family. He wants grandchildren to leave all this to." Quinn gestured at the land around them. "You're only 23. There's time. Out here, people marry young. Most of my friends already have wives and children." He paused, then added carefully, "I haven't found the right person yet, or I thought I hadn't." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Quinn, let me show you the north pasture," he interrupted, as though losing his nerve. "There's a view up there that's worth the ride." They rode together to the top of a low rise, and Margaret caught her breath at the vista. The land rolled away in all directions, golden in the afternoon light, with the ranch buildings nestled in the valley below. It was beautiful in a way she had never expected to appreciate, vast and wild and free. "This is what I see when I think about home," Quinn said quietly. "Not just the ranch, but all of this. The land, the sky, the space to breathe. I know it must seem harsh to you coming from a city." "It did at first," Margaret admitted. "But I'm starting to understand it. The beauty isn't gentle or pretty, but it's real, honest, like the people here." Quinn looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "When you first arrived, I thought you would leave within a week. You seemed so out of place, so lost. But you didn't leave. You stayed and you fought and you learned. And somewhere along the way, I started looking forward to seeing you more than anything else in my day. I wake up thinking about you and go to sleep the same way. I find excuses to ride over to your property just to spend a few more minutes in your company." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Quinn, I know it hasn't been long. I know you've been through a lot and you might not be ready, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I've fallen in love with you, Margaret, completely and entirely." The words she had been afraid to hope for, spoken plainly and honestly. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I thought it was just me," she said softly. "I tried to tell myself it was gratitude, that I was just grateful for your help, but I look for you every morning. When you're away, the days feel empty. When you smile at me, I feel like I could do anything. I fell in love with you too, Quinn. I think I started falling the first day we met." Quinn's face transformed with a joy so pure it took her breath away. He dismounted quickly and came to help her down from Daisy, his hands warm and sure on her waist. When her feet touched the ground, he did not let go. "May I kiss you?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Yes, please." The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, his lips soft against hers. But as Margaret responded, winding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more. Quinn pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair, and Margaret felt like she was flying and falling all at once. She had been kissed before, chased pecks from overeager suitors in Philadelphia, but this was something else entirely. This was passion and promise, and the meeting of two souls who had found each other against all odds. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said again, as though he could not quite believe he was allowed to say it. "I love you too." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other as the sun began to descend toward the horizon. Margaret felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as though every difficult step that had brought her to this place had been leading to this moment, to this man. "We should probably head back before it gets dark," Quinn said reluctantly. "But Margaret, I need to know, are you planning to stay? In Dalhart, I mean. Is this home now?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "This is home, your home." They rode back to the ranch together, hands occasionally brushing as they rode side by side. Martha took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly, insisting Margaret stay for supper. The meal was filled with warmth and laughter, and Margaret felt more at ease than she had since before her father's death. This was what family should feel like, she realized. Acceptance and affection given freely, without conditions or expectations. When it was time to leave, Quinn insisted on riding back with her to make sure she got home safely. At her door, he kissed her again, slow and sweet. "I'll come by tomorrow," he promised. "I'll be waiting." Over the following weeks, Margaret and Quinn's courtship became the talk of Dalhart. The city girl and the cowboy made an unlikely pair, or so the gossip said. But anyone who saw them together could see they were well matched. Quinn brought out Margaret's confidence and courage, while Margaret softened some of Quinn's rough edges and made him laugh more than anyone had seen in years. They rode together in the early mornings, racing across the plains with Margaret's laughter carrying on the wind. Quinn taught her to rope properly, and she taught him about the books she loved, reading to him in the evenings while they sat on her porch. They talked about everything, their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Margaret told Quinn about her father's death and her lonely childhood in Philadelphia. Quinn spoke about losing his mother to fever when he was 12 and the responsibility he felt for the ranch. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have seen more of the world before settling here," Quinn admitted one evening. "I've never been further east than Kansas City. You want to see more?" "Maybe someday, but not if it means leaving you behind." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, content. "We could travel together, after we're married." The words slipped out before she realized what she was saying, and she felt Quinn stiffen beside her. "Margaret, I'm sorry," she said quickly, pulling away. "I shouldn't have assumed. We've only been courting a few weeks." Quinn caught her hand, pulling her back. "No, you misunderstand. I wasn't objecting to the idea of marriage. I was trying to work up the courage to propose, and you beat me to it." He turned to face her fully, his eyes serious. "Margaret Jane Winters, will you marry me? I don't have a ring yet, and this isn't the romantic proposal you probably dreamed of, but I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life with you. I want to build a home together, raise children together, grow old together. Will you have me?" "Yes," Margaret said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, absolutely yes." They kissed in the fading twilight, and Margaret felt like her heart might burst with happiness. She had come to Texas with nothing, running from a life that held no future. And she had found everything: home, purpose, and a love deeper than anything she had imagined possible. The wedding was held 6 weeks later, in late October, when the brutal heat had finally broken. They married in the small church in Dalhart, with the whole town in attendance. Martha Walker had helped Margaret make a new dress from cream-colored silk that had cost a small fortune, but was worth every penny. Margaret's hair was piled high with autumn wildflowers woven through it, and when she walked down the aisle and saw Quinn waiting for her at the altar, his eyes bright with love and wonder, she knew she was the luckiest woman alive. The reception was held at the Walker Ranch, with tables groaning under the weight of food and a fiddle band playing late into the night. Margaret danced until her feet ached, passed from partner to partner as was traditional, but her eyes always found Quinn's across the crowd. When they finally slipped away as the party continued without them, riding together toward their future, Margaret felt complete for the first time in her life. They had decided to live at Margaret's property initially, at least until they determined the best arrangement. The house was small but cozy, and it was theirs now. Quinn had spent the past weeks making improvements, fixing the roof and reinforcing the porch, building new furniture and making it a proper home. That first night as husband and wife, Quinn carried Margaret over the threshold and set her down gently in the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Walker." "Mrs. Walker," Margaret repeated, testing out her new name. "I like the sound of that." "I love you," Quinn said, cupping her face in his hands. "I promise I will spend every day trying to deserve you." "You already do," Margaret assured him. "You saw me when I was at my lowest, most vulnerable, and you didn't laugh or judge. You taught me to be strong. You gave me confidence. You loved me before I even knew how to love myself in this new life." They kissed, and the kiss led to more, and Margaret discovered that love could be expressed in ways beyond words. Quinn was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the final piece of her new life falling into place. The first year of marriage had its challenges, as any first year does. Learning to live together, to navigate each other's habits and quirks, required patience and compromise. There were arguments about money, about the ranch work, about 1,000 small things, but they always talked through their differences and never went to bed angry. Margaret continued to develop her skills with the horses, and word began to spread about her ability to gentle even the most difficult animals. She had a light touch and endless patience, Quinn said, and horses responded to her in ways they did not with others. People started bringing her problem horses to work with, and she discovered she had a talent for it. The extra income was welcome, and the work gave her a sense of purpose beyond just maintaining her property. Quinn balanced his time between his father's ranch and helping Margaret build up her horse training business. Samuel Walker, seeing how happy his son was, had relaxed his expectations and started training Quinn's younger cousin to eventually take over more of the ranch operations. It gave Quinn the freedom to pursue his own path, working alongside his wife and building something together. Their second spring in Dalhart, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, her monthly courses late, and her body feeling strange and foreign, but she had been afraid to hope. When the doctor confirmed it, she rushed home to tell Quinn, finding him in the barn working with Copper, who had finally matured into a fine horse. "Quinn," she called, and something in her voice made him turn immediately concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Quinn, I'm going to have a baby." His face went blank with shock for a moment, then transformed with joy. He let out a whoop and swung her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We're going to have a baby." "You're happy." "Happy? Margaret, I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and thrilled and amazed all at once." He placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach. "There's a child in there. Our child." The pregnancy was difficult at times. The heat that summer was oppressive, and Margaret struggled with nausea and exhaustion. But Quinn was endlessly supportive, taking over more of her work and fussing over her health. Martha Walker came by frequently with advice and reassurance, having raised 3 children herself. Their son was born in December of 1884, during a cold snap that had everyone huddled near fires. The labor was long and painful, and there were moments when Margaret was certain she would die. But Martha and the midwife guided her through, and Quinn held her hand and refused to leave despite propriety saying he should wait outside. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Margaret felt a rush of love so powerful it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Quinn cut the cord with shaking hands and then held his son for the first time, looking down at the tiny face with absolute wonder. "He's perfect," Quinn whispered. "Margaret, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Matthew Jacob Walker, and he became the center of their world. Margaret had thought she understood love when she married Quinn, but this was different, fierce and protective and all-consuming. She would have walked through fire for this small person who depended on her for everything. Motherhood was exhausting and overwhelming and wonderful all at once. Matthew was a fussy baby who did not sleep well, and there were nights when Margaret paced the floor with him, singing soft lullabies while tears of exhaustion ran down her face. But there were also moments of perfect peace, Matthew sleeping on her chest, his tiny hand curled around her finger, or Quinn making silly faces to get him to smile. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, Margaret found herself reflecting on how far she had come. 3 years ago, she had been a frightened girl stepping off a train in a strange land, completely unprepared for the life ahead. Now she was a wife and mother, a skilled horsewoman, a small business owner. She had friends in town, a home she loved, and a family that meant everything to her. Quinn had changed too. The solitary cowboy had become a devoted husband and father, his easy confidence now tempered with tenderness. Margaret loved watching him with Matthew, the gentle way he handled their son, the patience he showed when teaching Matthew to walk or ride. "You're a wonderful father," she told him one evening as they watched Matthew toddle around the yard, chasing chickens. "I learned from the best," Quinn said. "My father taught me what it means to be a good man. I'm just trying to pass that on. You're succeeding." When Matthew was 2 years old, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because Matthew kept her too busy to dwell on her discomfort. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1887, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made Matthew hide under the bed. Sarah Rose Walker was everything her brother was not: calm, content, easy. She slept through the night from 6 weeks old and rarely fussed. Quinn doted on her shamelessly, and Margaret teased him about being wrapped around their daughter's tiny finger. "I never stood a chance," Quinn admitted, holding Sarah while she gazed up at him with wide eyes. "The moment I saw her, I was lost." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The horse training business continued to grow, and they eventually added a second barn to accommodate the demand. Quinn took over more of the training of young horses, while Margaret focused on the difficult cases, the abused or frightened animals that needed a gentle touch and infinite patience. One morning, a man arrived with a horse that had been so badly mistreated it would not let anyone near it. The horse, a beautiful gray mare, trembled in the corner of the stall, eyes wild with fear. "I was going to put her down," the man said, "but I heard you work miracles. I'll pay whatever you ask if you can save her." Margaret looked at the terrified animal and felt a familiar mix of compassion and determination. "Leave her with me. Come back in a month." It took weeks of patient work, just sitting in the stall with the mare, talking softly and slowly extending her hand. Eventually, the mare allowed Margaret to touch her, then to run her hands over her trembling body. Margaret discovered old scars, evidence of beatings and rough handling, and felt rage at whoever had damaged this beautiful creature. But slowly, carefully, the mare began to trust. When Margaret finally led her out of the stall and into the sunlight, Quinn was watching from the fence. "You're amazing," he said simply. She just needed someone to be patient with her, to show her that not all humans are cruel. "That's what I did with you," Quinn said with a slight smile. Margaret laughed. "I was never as bad as this mare." "No, but you were just as scared. And you needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself." Margaret walked over to the fence and kissed her husband. "I still need that sometimes. Thank you for never giving up on me." "Never," Quinn promised. As their children grew, Margaret and Quinn made sure to instill in them the values that had sustained them: hard work, kindness, resilience. Matthew, at 5 years old, was already following his father around, trying to help with the ranch work. Sarah, at 3, preferred to sit with Margaret and watch her mother work with the horses, her small face serious with concentration. "She's going to be like you," Quinn observed one afternoon. "She's got your gift with animals, and Matthew has your strength and determination. They're lucky children, having you as a mother." Margaret thought about her own mother, dead before Margaret could form lasting memories of her. She hoped she was doing justice to that legacy, creating a home filled with love and security. The years continued to pass, marked by the seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. There were good years and bad, droughts that tested their resources and storms that damaged buildings. But they faced everything together, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating the victories. When Matthew was 8 and Sarah 6, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. She had thought they were done having children, content with their son and daughter, but apparently fate had other plans. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, perhaps because she was older now, in her early 30s, or perhaps because she was simply tired from chasing 2 active children. The baby, another son they named Samuel after Quinn's father, arrived in the winter of 1892. He was a big baby, healthy and strong, with a pair of lungs that announced his presence to the world. 3 children, Quinn said, looking slightly dazed as he held his new son. "We have 3 children. Are you overwhelmed?" "Completely. and completely happy. Samuel's birth brought the family closer together. Matthew and Sarah were old enough to help care for their baby brother, and the house was filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of a large family. Margaret sometimes felt exhausted, pulled in a dozen directions at once, but she would not have traded it for anything. As the children grew, they became integral parts of the family business. Matthew learned to train horses alongside his parents, showing an intuitive understanding of the animals. Sarah developed her mother's gentle touch and patience, able to calm even the most skittish horse. Young Samuel was still finding his way, but he showed signs of inheriting his father's natural athleticism and confidence. The Walker family became well known throughout the region. People came from hundreds of miles away to have Margaret or Quinn train their horses, and the property that had once seemed impossibly rustic now boasted 3 barns, extensive corrals, and a house that had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. Quinn's father passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1895, at the age of 73. It was a loss that hit Quinn hard, but he took comfort in knowing his father had lived to see his grandchildren and had died proud of the man his son had become. The ranch passed to Quinn's cousin as planned, but the families remained close, supporting each other as Samuel Walker would have wanted. Margaret's property, their property now, had become something beyond what she had ever imagined that first desperate day when she arrived in Dalhart. It was not just a place to live, but a legacy to pass on to their children. The land that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving had become home in the truest sense, shaped by their labor and love into something beautiful. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage, Matthew, now 15, and helping with evening chores while Sarah and Samuel played in the yard, Quinn took Margaret's hand. "You ever miss Philadelphia?" he asked. Margaret thought about the city of her birth, the narrow streets and crowded buildings, the life of quiet desperation she might have lived. "No," she said honestly. "I think I needed to lose that life to find this one, to find you." "I thank God for that telegram every day," Quinn said. "I can't imagine my life without you, without this." He gestured at their children, their land, everything they had built together. "You remember the first time we met? I was standing in the yard, completely lost and overwhelmed. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, all fire and determination under that fear. I wanted to help you, but I also wanted to know you. And the more I got to know you, the more I loved you. You taught me to ride. But more than that, you taught me to believe in myself, in this place, in the possibility of happiness. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Quinn corrected. "You taught me what it means to be brave. Coming out here alone, starting over, that took more courage than anything I've ever done. You inspired me to be better, to reach higher." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky blazed with color. The children's laughter drifted across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. It was a perfect moment, the kind that Margaret had learned to recognize and treasure. Life continued its steady march forward. Matthew grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, and began courting a girl from town. Sarah developed into a skilled horsewoman who could outride most of the men in the county. Samuel, always the wild one, kept them entertained with his antics and boundless energy. Margaret and Quinn aged too, though they both remained active and healthy. Silver threads appeared in Margaret's auburn hair, and Quinn's face became more weathered. But they moved through life together with the ease of long partnership, able to communicate with a glance, anticipating each other's needs without words. When Matthew married at 21 and brought his bride home to live on the property, building a small house on the far corner of the land, Margaret felt the bittersweet pang of watching her child become a man. But she also felt pride and joy, seeing him start his own family and knowing the legacy would continue. Sarah, independent and strong-willed, announced at 19 that she wanted to travel before settling down. Margaret and Quinn gave her their blessing and enough money to see something of the world they had never seen themselves. She was gone for a year, sending letters from Denver, San Francisco, and even as far as Seattle. When she returned, sun-bronzed and full of stories, she announced that she finally understood why they loved Texas so much. "The world is big and beautiful," Sarah said, "but this is home. This is where I belong." She eventually married a neighboring rancher's son, a quiet young man who clearly adored her, and they built a life together that balanced independence with partnership, just as her parents had modeled. Samuel, the youngest, was the last to leave the nest. He had inherited his father's adventurous spirit and his mother's determination, and at 18 he headed north to Montana to work on a cattle drive. He returned 6 months later, full of stories and maturity, and announced he was ready to settle down and really learn the family business. "I needed to see something else to appreciate what we have here," he explained. "Now I know. This is where I want to be." As Margaret entered her 50s, she looked back on her life with wonder and gratitude. The frightened city girl who had stepped off the train in Dalhart was gone, transformed into a woman who had built a life beyond her wildest dreams. She had raised 3 children into capable, loving adults. She had created a successful business that helped hundreds of horses and their owners. Most importantly, she had loved and been loved by a man who had believed in her from the very beginning. Quinn was in his mid-50s now, still strong but moving a bit more carefully, jokes about old bones becoming more frequent. But his eyes still lit up when he looked at Margaret, and his love for her had only deepened with time. One summer evening, as they celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary with their children and grandchildren gathered around Matthew, and his wife had given them 2 grandchildren, with a third on the way, Margaret felt overwhelmed with emotion. "What are you thinking about?" Quinn asked, noticing her tears. "Everything, all of this. How unlikely it all was and how perfect it turned out to be." "It wasn't luck," Quinn said firmly. "It was you. Your courage, your determination, your willingness to try even when you were terrified. You built this, Margaret." "We built it together." "They laughed at me when I first arrived," Margaret remembered. "The clumsy city girl who didn't know anything. Remember, I remember. And then you showed them all who you really were. You were never clumsy, you were learning. There's a difference. You're the one who taught me, to ride, to rope, to survive. But most of all, you taught me to believe in myself." "I just saw what was already there," Quinn said, pulling her close. "You had the strength all along, you just needed to discover it." As the evening wound down and their family prepared to head home, Margaret stood on the porch with Quinn, watching the grandchildren play in the fading light. The land stretched out before them, familiar and beloved, shaped by decades of work and love. "I love you," Margaret said, as she had said thousands of times over the years. "I love you too," Quinn replied. "Every day more than the day before." The years continued to pass with the gentle inevitability of time. Margaret and Quinn eventually handed over more of the daily operations to their children, though they remained active and involved. They had earned their rest, but neither was content to sit idle. Quinn still rode the fence lines, checking on things with a practiced eye. Margaret still worked with the occasional difficult horse, her patience and skill undiminished by age. They watched their grandchildren grow, delighting in their personalities and accomplishments. They attended weddings and celebrations, weathered illnesses and losses, supported their family through good times and bad. Through it all, They remained each other's constant, the foundation on which everything else was built. When Quinn turned 65, Margaret threw him a celebration that brought together what seemed like half the county. People came from miles around to honor a man who had lived his life with integrity and kindness, who had built something lasting and good. The speeches and toasts went on for hours, but the moment Margaret treasured most was late in the evening when they had a moment alone. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here?" she asked. "Old and gray and surrounded by all this." "When I first saw you standing in that dusty yard, looking lost and determined all at once, I imagined everything," Quinn admitted. "I imagined growing old with you, building a life together. It seemed impossible then, but I couldn't stop hoping." "You made it all possible," Margaret said. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You taught me everything that matters." "We taught each other," Quinn corrected gently. "You taught me that love is about partnership, about supporting each other through everything. You taught me that strength comes in many forms, and that courage is continuing even when you're afraid." They danced together as the sun set, moving slowly to music only they could hear. Margaret rested her head on Quinn's shoulder and felt perfectly content. This was what she had been searching for all those years ago, though she had not known it then. Not just safety or security, but true partnership. Someone who saw her completely and loved her anyway. Someone who made her better while accepting who she was. As they moved into their late 60s, Margaret and Quinn began to think about the future and what would happen to their legacy. The property would pass to their children, that was certain, but they wanted to ensure the business continued in the spirit they had established. They spent hours talking with Matthew, Sarah, and Samuel, sharing not just the practical knowledge of training horses but the philosophy behind it. "It's not about breaking a horse's spirit," Margaret explained to Samuel's oldest son, now 15 and learning the trade. "It's about building a partnership, about respect and trust. Force might work in the short term, but patience and kindness create something lasting." "That's how Grandma is with everyone," the boy said with a grin. "Patient and kind." "It served me well," Margaret agreed. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret woke to find Quinn already up, standing at the window and looking out at the land they had worked for so many years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, joining him. "Everything. Nothing. Just feeling grateful, I suppose." He put his arm around her shoulders. "We've had a good life, Margaret, better than I ever dreamed possible." "We're not done yet," Margaret said firmly. "We've got years left in us." "I know. But at our age, you start to think about these things. And I want you to know that every single day with you has been a gift. Even the hard days, the days when we argued or struggled or faced challenges, I wouldn't trade them for anything, because they were all spent with you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Quinn Walker, after all these years, you can still make me cry. I still love you as much as I did that first day I kissed you on the hill overlooking the ranch. More, even. I didn't know it was possible to love someone this much." They stood together, watching the sun rise over the land they loved, and Margaret felt a peace settle over her. Whatever time they had left, whether years or decades, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Spring rains brought green to the plains. Summer heat tested their endurance. Autumn provided relief and harvest, and winter required resilience and preparation. Margaret and Quinn moved through it all with the practiced ease of people who had learned to work with nature rather than against it. As Margaret approached 70, she remained remarkably healthy and active, though she moved more slowly and tired more easily. Quinn, at 71, had developed some arthritis in his hands but refused to let it slow him down significantly. They adapted, finding new ways to do familiar tasks, accepting help when needed but maintaining their independence fiercely. Their children, now in their 40s and 50s themselves, watched over them with gentle vigilance. Matthew lived closest and stopped by daily, ostensibly to check on the horses but really to check on his parents. Sarah visited weekly with food and news from town. Samuel, who had taken over the primary training operation, worked alongside them as much as they would allow. "We're not invalid," Quinn would grumble good-naturedly when his children fussed too much. "We know, Pa," Sarah would reply. "We just love you." The grandchildren, now ranging from young adults to teenagers, provided endless entertainment and joy. They came by to learn, to share their lives, to simply spend time with the grandparents who had been such a constant presence. Margaret loved these visits, loved seeing pieces of herself and Quinn reflected in these young faces. One particularly meaningful day, Margaret's oldest granddaughter Matthew's daughter came to her with a request. "Grandma, will you teach me to train horses? Really teach me the way Grandpa taught you?" Margaret felt her heart swell. "Of course, dear, but it won't be easy. It requires patience and dedication. I know. That's why I want to learn from you. Everyone says you're the best." So Margaret took on her granddaughter as an apprentice, passing down not just skills but philosophy, history, love. She told stories of her first days in Texas, of learning to ride on Daisy, of the patient cowboy who had believed in a clumsy city girl. Her granddaughter listened with wide eyes, asking questions, soaking up every word. "You were brave, Grandma," the girl said one afternoon as they worked with a skittish yearling. "I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified most of the time. But you did it anyway. That's what bravery is." Margaret smiled, recognizing Quinn's wisdom in those words. The lessons he had taught her all those years ago were being passed down to another generation. As they moved into their mid-70s, Margaret and Quinn began to slow down more noticeably. They spent more time on the porch, watching others do the work they once did, offering advice and encouragement. They took daily walks together, moving at a gentle pace, holding hands like young lovers. "You have any regrets?" Margaret asked one evening as they watched the sun set a ritual they had maintained for over 40 years of marriage. Quinn considered the question carefully. "I regret that my mother didn't live to meet you and know our children. I regret that we couldn't protect our family from every hurt and disappointment. But about us, about our life together, no regrets, not a single one." "I used to regret that I didn't find you sooner," Margaret admitted, "that we didn't have more time. But then I realized that everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. I had to lose everything to find you. I had to become someone new to be ready for this life. And I had to wait for you," Quinn added. "I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew I hadn't found it yet. And then you stepped off that train and I knew. You knew that quickly. Not that I loved you, not yet, but I knew you were important, that you were going to change my life. I was right." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. The night sounds of the ranch surrounded them, horses moving in their stalls, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through grass. These were the sounds of home, familiar as breathing. Quinn's health began to decline more noticeably as he approached 80. His arthritis worsened, and he developed a persistent cough that worried everyone. But he refused to stop working entirely, still insisting on checking the horses each morning and evening, still offering guidance to his children and grandchildren. "I'll rest when I'm dead," he told Margaret when she urged him to take it easier. "Don't joke about that." "I'm not joking. This is my life, Margaret, the work, the family, the land. I can't just stop being who I am." Margaret understood because she felt the same way. But she also saw him moving more slowly, breathing more heavily, and she felt fear clutch at her heart. After so many years together, the thought of losing him was unbearable. On a warm spring morning in 1928, 45 years after Margaret had first arrived in Dalhart, Quinn did not wake up. Margaret stirred beside him, reaching out automatically as she always did, and felt immediately that something was wrong. He was still warm, but still in a way that was absolute and final. "Quinn," she whispered, though she already knew he could not hear her. "Oh, my love." The family gathered quickly, drawn by the news that spread through the ranch like wildfire. They surrounded Margaret with love and support, but she felt hollowed out, as though a piece of her soul had been torn away. Quinn had been her partner for 45 years, her best friend, her constant. How did one continue without that? The funeral was enormous, with people coming from across the state to pay their respects to a man who had lived his life with honor and integrity. Margaret stood beside the grave in black, supported by her children, and listened to the words wash over her. They spoke of Quinn's accomplishments, his kindness, his legacy. All true, all important. But what mattered most to Margaret was simpler. He had loved her completely and faithfully for 45 years. He had believed in her when no one else did. He had taught her to ride and, more importantly, to believe in herself. In the weeks that followed, Margaret moved through her grief with the same determination she had brought to every challenge in her life. She missed Quinn with an ache that never quite faded, but she also felt his presence everywhere in the land they had worked together, in the faces of their children and grandchildren, in the lessons he had taught and the love he had given. She continued to work with horses, finding comfort in the familiar routine. Her children worried about her living alone, but Margaret was not ready to give up her independence. This house held too many memories, too much of the life she had built with Quinn. One afternoon, several months after Quinn's death, Margaret's granddaughter found her in the barn, working with a nervous filly. "How do you do it, Grandma? How do you keep going?" Margaret thought about the question carefully. "Your grandfather taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing despite the fear. He taught me to believe in myself, to trust in my own strength. Those lessons didn't die with him. They're part of who I am now." You still miss him, every single day, every single moment, but I also feel grateful for the time we had. 45 years of love and partnership, not everyone gets that. And he lives on in all of you in this place, in everything we built together. As Margaret moved through her late 70s, her health remained surprisingly good. She credited hard work and clean living, but her children suspected it was sheer stubbornness keeping her going. She maintained her daily routine, worked with horses when she felt up to it, and spent time with her ever-growing family. Matthew had given her 5 grandchildren, Sarah 4, and Samuel 3, 12 grandchildren in total, plus a growing number of great-grandchildren. The family gatherings were chaotic and loud and filled with love. Margaret presided over them all with quiet contentment, grateful for every face, every laugh, every moment. She often thought about that frightened girl who had stepped off the train in Dalhart so many years ago. How shocked that girl would be to see what her life had become. How amazed she would be to know that the harsh land that had seemed so unforgiving would become home. That the handsome cowboy who had offered to teach her to ride would become her entire world. As she approached 80, Margaret began to feel tired in a way that went beyond the physical. She had lived a long, full life. She had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had built something lasting and good, and she missed Quinn with an intensity that time had not diminished. One crisp October morning, Margaret woke to the golden light of autumn streaming through her window. She felt peaceful, content, ready. She dressed carefully in her favorite dress and walked slowly to the barn, greeting each horse by name, running her hands over their familiar forms one last time. Then she made her way to the small rise north of the house, the place where Quinn had first told her he loved her all those years ago. She sat down in the grass, looking out over the land that had become home, and felt Quinn's presence beside her as clearly as if he were truly there. "I'm ready," she whispered to the wind. "I'm ready to be with you again." Her family found her there that evening, looking peaceful and content, a slight smile on her lips. She had died as she had lived on her own terms in the place she loved, surrounded by the legacy she had built. Margaret's funeral was as large as Quinn's had been, a testament to the impact she had made on everyone who knew her. They laid her to rest beside Quinn, two headstones side by side looking out over the land they had loved. In the years that followed, the family kept the ranch and the horse training business going, passing down the lessons Margaret and Quinn had taught about patience and kindness, about courage and determination, about the power of believing in oneself and others. The property remained in the family, generation after generation, a living testament to the love story that had started with a frightened city girl and a patient cowboy. Stories were told and retold how Margaret had arrived knowing nothing and learned everything, how Quinn had taught her to ride and to believe, how they had built a life together that spanned nearly half a century. The stories became family legend, shared with each new generation, a reminder of where they came from and the values that mattered most. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Texas plains in a blaze of color, family members swore they could see two figures on the rise north of the house, standing close together and looking out over the land they had loved. Whether it was truly Margaret and Quinn or just wishful thinking didn't really matter. Their love had been real and lasting, and it lived on in the family they had created, the legacy they had built, and the lessons they had taught about courage, determination, and the transformative power of believing in someone completely. The story of the clumsy city girl and the cowboy who taught her to ride became more than just a romance. It became a testament to the truth that we all have the capacity to become more than we imagine, if only someone believes in us enough to help us see our own strength. Margaret and Quinn had given each other that gift, and in doing so, they had created something that would endure long after they were gone, a love story for the ages, set against the vast beauty of the Texas plains. Proof that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings.